The United States came out of our Civil War with a higher debt to GDP ratio than before, and
Oh,
it was
wow.
almost able to retire the entirety of that debt by the eve of World War One.
Dr. Eichengreen, reading your book, one could come away concluding that parliaments and republics were formed in response to the need to borrow more money. Maybe this is an exaggeration on my part, but is this assessment way off the mark?
It's one popular interpretation of the emergence of um, constitutional government, the glorious revolution in England in
In the
1688.
yeah,
That it was really the power of investors that uh, the monarchy required population of willing investors, and their emergence as a political force that led to the appearance of Republican parliamentary forms of government, where there were checks and balances limiting arbitrary action by uh, the sovereign, that the sovereign had to concede something, namely limits on his or her sovereign powers in return for continuing to be able to borrow. So that's one strand of a large political science literature on how it was we see the emergence of parliamentary and republican forms of government. But I think one can tell similar stories of the republican governments of the Italian city-states of Genoa, Florence, Venice, and others, even before the case of the Glorious Revolution in England. One can tell similar stories about the emergence of the Estates General, the Republican legislatures of the Low Countries, of what we now refer to as the Netherlands. So, as with all things historical, the complete story is undoubtedly more complicated. But for a historian of public debt, this is a significant part of that story.
So we're talking about early Republican forms of government, some of which include parliaments, others a different sort of body of legislature. Were they better able to borrow money? I think I know the answer to that, but there's a reason for that, right?
Um, Boy, is there a large literature disputing the answer to that
Oh,
question.
disputing. Okay.
Indeed, disputing. So there was an early and very influential article by the Nobel Prize winning economic historian Douglas North and political scientist at Stanford, Barry Weingast, that asserted indeed you could see that the purse strings were loosened after the transition to parliamentary government in Britain. After the Glorious Revolution, interest rates came down, and the king was able to borrow more freely at lower interest rates. And then lots of subsequent economic historians revisited their data and conclusions. I think where we come out now is that, yes, there is an effect, but it takes longer to materialize than North and Weingast initially asserted. So they said Glorious Revolution occurs in 1688, form of government in Britain changes, interest rates immediately come down to lower levels, and borrowing for the king becomes easier. 3 decades later, 4 decades later, most people read the evidence of saying it took longer. It took a couple of generations before the effect really materialized, before people were convinced that this change in government and these checks on arbitrary action by the king were durable and credible. So the situation was not transformed overnight, but eventually it was transformed.
Two clarifying follow-up questions, please. When we talk about lower interest rates, that means that investors felt more comfortable lending to these forms of government. In this case, we're talking about um, Britain in the late 17th century. Is one of the reasons that they felt more comfortable in lending to Britain the fact that there was a parliament, that there were committees that were discussing that there was, I don't know, I'm making up this word, more transparency than, let's say, if it was just a king making decisions in his bedchamber about how much to spend? Is that the reason?
Yes, so I think there was more transparency, and there um, was the fact that the king basically had to have parliamentary assent now in order to borrow.
Yeah,
So it's transparency and it's checks and balances.
kind of limitations. He couldn't just spend so much money where he couldn't pay the original debt back anymore.
But other cases like the Dutch Estates General, it was very much transparency where they the Estates General, the legislature equivalent, would appoint an inspector general who would, publish accounts that would make available lots of more and better information than had been available before on the state's true finances.
It's like now there are people, or at least in this case, a person that with a whip saying, "No, you can't spend money on this. This is how much money we have." It's tightly, perhaps not as tightly as today's standards, but it was tightly controlled, the expenditure of money, and that's what made investors or lenders feel a little more comfortable.
More tightly controlled.
More tightly controlled. There you go. Going back in time, going forward, actually in time, I want to go back to a phrase that you and I kept on using and distinguish it for what happens in the latter half of the 19th century. We talked about Republican governments, we talked about early in Republican city states, and we talked about the Republic government of the Netherlands, the Low Countries. These are all Republican forms of government. They're not true democracies. The voting franchise is not widespread. As we move forward in the 19th century, and surely in the beginning of the 20th century, everyone starts to vote. I mean, relatively everyone, women, people that don't have property. Did this wreak havoc on the level of debt? Did this cause more demand for public debt?
It certainly complicated the public debt landscape. So in the book, we look at a number of episodes in the 19th century where the extent of the franchise was limited, where only men with property were enfranchised and could vote, as was the case in Britain, even though it had 3 reform acts in the 19th century, which extended the franchise was still limited to people with a certain amount of property or a certain amount of wealth. So people with property or wealth tend to also be bondholders, or their interests tend to be aligned with those of the bondholders.
Interesting.
One explanation for how it was Britain was able to run budget surpluses, primary budget surpluses, almost in every year between 1821, when it finally came out of the Napoleonic and French Wars, and 1899, the end of the century, is that...
I'm sorry, let me stop you one, please. Britain ran budget surpluses from 1821 to 1899?
Primary budget surpluses every year for 8 decades, and it worked down what had been a very, very heavy public debt, because the bondholders, the creditors, the investors were dominated the legislature. The United States came out of our Civil War with a higher debt to GDP ratio than before, and it was almost able to retire the entirety of that debt by the eve of World War I, even though we had universal male white suffrage, even though debtors, the farmers in the populist era were outspoken debtors, even though debtors as well as creditors could vote. So what I'm saying here is that, yes, universal franchise democracy complicates matters, but you can still have fiscal discipline in
Yeah.
a democracy. So just this week with a co-author, I looked at cases since 1980 where countries were able to run primary budget surpluses of at least 3% of GDP for at least 5 consecutive years. You know, something we aspire to in the United States, but fail at.
Of course, yeah.
And democracies are more likely to do that than non-democratic countries, than autocracies. So democracies, when they get their act together, can deal with an inherited debt problem. Not so much when the democracy is polarized, when there are big differences in priorities between left and right, if you will. In that case, there is starve the beast behavior where taxes are cut to prevent the other party from increasing spending on its preferred programs when the other party comes into power. It's hard to sustain debt consolidation process when you're not going to be in office next year. But when polarization has been low, when government has been relatively stable, democracy and bringing down public debt has gone together.
In the minute we have left of this segment, I wanted to get your input on a development in the 19th century. I'm going back in time, and we're going to talk about surpluses in the next segment as well. Here's my question about the 19th century. Why foreign debt? How did many nations, not just Britain, in the Americas and other areas of the world, started borrowing more, sort of developing their own industry to borrow. But many of them borrowed outside their own sovereign state. I think in your book, you give several examples about Argentina and others. Why?
Because there is a lack of domestic savings. There's a big per capita income gap between the leading European powers, Britain, France, Prussia, and the like on the one hand, and newly independent republics in Latin America in the 1820s.
Yeah.
This is the first industrial revolution when Europe takes off and the rest of the world doesn't economically. And second, big differences in financial development that for the reasons we were talking about before, markets and public debt develop first in Europe. So there are deep and liquid financial markets on which newly independent Latin American republics can float bonds in the 1820s, where they don't have bond markets at home yet. It takes them decades and more to develop those markets.
And in many ways, they're still dependent on those global markets to finance their operations at home.
They are. So there's been a push in recent decades to try to develop domestic financial markets in developing countries, middle-income countries, to try to be able to float bonds, place bonds with domestic investors, as opposed to foreign investors. And my view is that that effort has met with mixed success.
Yeah. We'll be back after a short break to talk about central banks.